what is autism spectrum disorder?
Well, that's not a simple question, in fact. So it's defined by impairments in social interaction and social communication, with also repetitive or restrictive behaviours. But that's quite a kind of cold definition. And I think the reality is it's not really a disorder. It's probably many different ones that have been sort of thrown into a pot together. It's just a description of something that we can see, but we don't really understand. My hope is that in 20 years' time, there won't be an autism spectrum disorder. There was a theory that was widespread 50 years ago that cold mothers were what caused the symptoms of autism in the children. It was surprisingly prevalent, and for a long time was kind of the dominant theory.
What are the big questions that you're currently tackling and trying to decipher in autism? What are you working on?
So what I'm really interested in at the moment is understanding how genetic changes result in phenotype changes, so in behaviour changes eventually. I think will give us a much better understanding of what's happening and potentially treatments for anyone who wants treatment.
Jonathan Haidt, very famous sociologist, written a number of very popular books. His thesis is that social media use, mainly in females, is causing a giant rewiring of basically adolescent brains.
The data isn't great, and I think it's not clear what effect it has on the wiring of the brain. But I think, there's at least better evidence that attention spans are affected. I don't know that there's that much evidence that things have been massively rewired as such.
So what are the crucial differences in the development of the male versus female brain?
Well, I mean, that's another open question, actually. So maybe something that we all kind of assume is that the hormones really kick in at puberty, but that's not true.
I discovered in my final year of college that a lot of studies, and even entire fields in some cases, are just studied in men, which is half of the world. So it's like we don't really have a very good idea what's happening here in the other half of the world.
There is now, I think, a big drive to say we need to look in males and females, at least. And so it's only quite recently that people are beginning to kind of discover sex differences that are arising much earlier in terms of science formation. So I think it's an open question, but we don't know in great detail, actually.
The next decade in neuroscience in general, I want to know, what are you most scared of?
What I'm most afraid of? Well, that's easy. I'm most afraid of AI. And if I could wave a magic wand and, make it go back, I would. Genie's out the bottle, we're where we are. But I do worry about employment. I think we need, we may moan about jobs, but we do need work, at least in society as it stands, to give meaning and purpose to our life. Imagine that they finally get their act together on self-driving cars and, all driving jobs disappear. We as a society are just going to have to adapt to that and hopefully make it through.
Dr. Laura Andreae is a developmental neuroscientist from King's College London. She has conducted pioneering research into how our synaptic connections are laid down during childhood. Basically, how our neurons link up in critical ways during development that make us us. She's also a world foremost expert in the development of autism and intellectual disorders on a synapse level. In this podcast, we discuss the neural mechanisms of autism, what's actually happening in the brain. We talk about how autism can be a superpower for many, achieving incredible things, but how we also can better support those with autism in our society today. And ultimately how we can better leverage their brilliance for the betterment of all of humanity. If you enjoy what I'm trying to do here by speaking to the brightest neuroscience researchers around the world, then please consider subscribing on YouTube and following on Spotify. It really supports the channel and it helps us grow. I promise the episodes will only get better and better from here. But for now, thank you so much and enjoy the episode. Dr. Laura Andreae, what is happening in the brains of children during development?
That's a very big question.
I like to start with big questions.
I mean, a lot is happening. And I guess, you have to think about it not just, I guess I wouldn't think about it just as children, right? I mean, there's, in terms of I guess what I'm interested in, it's the whole of the development of the brain, right from, I guess, the kind of first times when brain cells, so neurons, are starting to make connections with each other. How do you form those initial connections? and then how does the brain kind of wire up in the right way so that you can kind of hit the ground running when you kind of need to do things. And clearly, as you're kind of growing up, different things sort of come online, as it were, at different points. So you're forming all these synaptic connections all the time. You're getting this massive increase in connectivity. So that's going on, from before you're born and then all the way through childhood. And then at the same time, stuff is happening in the outside world. So, you're getting sort of sensory experiences, you're starting to learn stuff, you're, picking up language, working out how to move everything. So there's this huge amount of feedback and plasticity going on at the same time. So it's obviously very complicated. We don't really understand, to be honest, a lot about what is going on. And then, of course, there's this sort of period during adolescence, if that counts as childhood, where things are kind of being refined, and there's an idea which is actually there's some evidence for it, but there isn't huge amounts of data that you get this kind of pruning period where you've got all these connections, lots and lots of connections beforehand, and then the brain is kind of getting rid of the stuff that it doesn't want, doesn't need, and you're going to refine those the kind of critical ones, so that you then have a sort of decrease in the total number of connections. So from a connectivity point, that's the main thing that's happening.
Very interesting. I actually thought the pruning hypothesis or theory was the dominant one in the field, and that that there was a decent amount of evidence for it. Talk around that a little bit more.
Well, that's not really my field. So I guess the bit that I'm interested in is before then. I actually have a colleague who is interested in this and dug into this a bit. So I kind of feel like I shouldn't speak with great authority on this. But there's certainly, so don't get me wrong, there's clearly refinement that goes on. And that's really been shown in multiple species in multiple different ways. But some of the actual, because it's very hard to do experiments in people, and so it tends to be kind of proxy type studies, and then maybe a little bit of post-mortem tissue, which is always a bit difficult because it's quite rare to get hold, especially in that age group, and it's quite hard to interpret some of the data. So if you look in detail at some of these papers, they have very, very small sample sizes if it's post-mortem, which is completely reasonable. But then, do you hang an entire thesis on it? So I think I probably wouldn't want to dwell too much on that. I think it is definitely what everybody thinks. But I haven't drilled down into the primary literature personally. But I have a colleague who maybe suggested that it wasn't as strong as it could be, considering how dogmatic, how part of the scientific dogma that idea is. I certainly, I assume that that's happening, but on the kind of to-do list it would be interesting just to explore that a bit more and in a bit more detail, because often when you start looking, you find that even if something is probably broadly true, there are sophistications and sort of specificity that's going on that could be quite interesting. But
absolutely. Absolutely. One of the reasons that I want to do this podcast is I'm on a journey to correct my own knowledge of the brain. So when someone points out something where I was like, I thought I read something different, I'm very eager to dive into that and hopefully bring the listeners along with me. Where do you think are some other myths or misnomers about the development of the brain? Common things that people might believe about the development of the brain that maybe in the past few decades have actually either been shown to be untrue or maybe are less likely than we previously thought.
What would be? I think so. There's obviously, some of the work I do is in neurodevelopmental disorders. And it was very striking to me that, so for example, in the field of autism, there was a theory that was widespread, 50 years ago, that cold mothers were what caused the symptoms of autism in the children, and which that to me seems kind of insane. But on the other hand, actually that theory has persisted in particularly some areas, longer than you might expect. So whilst
emotionally cold or temperature
emotionally
cold?
cold,
Emotionally
yes. So
cold. Okay.
it's the refrigerator mother was the idea,
Gotcha.
but it was surprisingly prevalent,
Wow.
this concept, and for a long time was kind of the dominant theory, and it was actually quite, I mean, there were people like Uta Frith who were kind of in the kind of early vanguard of people who were kind of going, no, this is a brain development situation, and actually we can study how very young children behave, and we can study brain size, and then people started doing MRI scans, and it became clear over time that this was nothing to do with parenting, and was largely to do with the interaction between genetics and environmental issues that would cause these different sort of neurodevelopmental disorders. So I think that's a myth that I think you probably haven't heard of, and in a way it's debunked, but it was around not that long ago. There was one interesting myth that I actually was really surprised about. Let me see if I can remember this. So I had to write a little short editorial piece as just an exercise, actually, and I thought I would do it. I'd read this story about how I think Einstein's brain was meant to have dramatically more glial cells in it, I think, than anyone else's, and I thought I would write something just sort of interesting about glia. And anyway, and then I looked into it, and it turned out to just be not true. And I couldn't even track down where it had appeared, but it turned, I went down this kind of rabbit hole, and finally found sort of people who had also sort of investigated this, and it turned out that I mean, his brain got divided up and sent round to lots of places around the world, I think, because everyone thought it would be interesting to look at Einstein's brain.
Yeah.
And it's got completely normal numbers of glia. So there was that was one thing where I was sort of they wanted to put a little put it as a sort of fun fact about glia, and anyway it turned out to not be true.
Yeah.
So that was a small thing, but I think broadly speaking, I don't think there were so many myths, because most people don't know very much, and actually there's a lot that we still don't know as scientists. So to some extent, you can't debunk something until you're pretty confident of something else.
Yes, absolutely. So what are the crucial differences in the development of the male versus female brain, boys versus girls? What are the crucial details going on there?
Well, I mean, that's another open question, actually. So obviously there are hormonal changes, and actually I think maybe something that we all kind of assume is that the hormones really kick in at puberty, but that's not true. So you definitely get hormones that have these sort of oscillations sort of throughout development, and you'll get these little bursts of your sex hormones much earlier, actually, that probably do have effects on brain development as well. We did, as you might know, we did a study where we looked at the difference in synapse formation between males and females. And I have to say, we were totally surprised to find that the trajectories were quite different. Now, it would be interesting to revisit that, see how specific it was. Do we see this in other circuits, in other species? This was in mice. And actually, when I kind of looked into it a bit more, I found that as people are starting to say, for years and years, decades, in fact, people have tended to study males. Right. Yeah. That's true in people, and it's true if you work in research organisms, model systems. And there is now, I think, a big drive to say we need to look in males and females, at least. And so it's only quite recently that people are beginning to kind of discover sex differences that are arising much earlier in terms of synapse formation. So I think it's something, it's an open question, and there's lots of interesting stuff to do, but we don't know in great detail, actually.
Yeah. This was a really interesting fact to me that I discovered in my final year of college, that a lot of studies, and even entire fields in some cases, are just studied in men, which is half of the world. So it's like we don't really have a very good idea what's happening here in the other half of the world. And like, this is true for some studies, but there are entire fields where they're very dominantly studied in men, which is clearly an issue.
It definitely is. And there are, particularly in terms of how the brain develops, there are almost certainly going to be differences. And if you're interested in neurodevelopmental disorders, right, they definitely affect males differently from females, certainly in model systems, probably in people too. So, this is something that I think it's really important to explore. They manifest differently. Diagnostic levels are different, and there can be lots of reasons for that. But yeah, I think if you don't look, you're not
Yeah.
going to find out. And there may be different ways that will be really helpful in terms of managing people with certain disorders that will be different. If you think of neurological diseases, they often have different incidence in males and females, or men and women, whatever. So yeah, I think it's really, really important. And actually, to be fair, a lot of the funding bodies are now getting kind of quite a hard line about it and going, look, if you're only going to do experiments in males, you need to have a very good reason why,
Yeah.
or we're going to be unimpressed.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes sense. Makes sense, as they should be. I'm curious on getting your perspective on things. So Jonathan Haidt, very famous sociologist, written a number of very popular books. He's recently come out with this new book I'm reading at the moment called The Anxious Generation. His thesis is that social media use, mainly in females, is causing a giant rewiring of basically adolescent brains, generally through the ages of 10 to 14, where they're engaging more in social media, they're not engaging in play. This is causing a whole host of mental illness issues like anxiety and depression. I'm kind of curious on your perspective on all of this. How do you think social media, mobile phone usage, all of this, that's, where the world is trending, how is this going to impact us on the development of brains? Even on a basic neurological level, on the foundational circuitry, like how is this going to affect us?
Okay, well, the short answer is we don't know. And actually, the data on the effect of social media on not just our brains but our mental state is iffy, right? I mean, it's something that people in some ways it seems intuitively obvious if you kind of have teenage kids, as I do. On the other hand, actually, the data isn't great. And I think it's not clear what effect it has on the wiring of the brain. I think what's probably fair. I mean, again, this is not my field, so this is I'm going to say this before all these questions. A caveat is not my field, but I think there's pretty at least better evidence that attention spans are affected, and that feels intuitively true. But that's not a very scientific thing to say, is it? And that I think we've all noticed that. But if you put people into some sort of camp and removed all their phones and devices and access social media, would they then gave them some, I don't know, a novel and a jigsaw puzzle, would they be unable to concentrate? I suspect not. I suspect that then with the sort of the crack cocaine of attention removed, you would then kind of go, oh, well, I guess I'll read this book, and you probably get into it. So I don't know that there's that much evidence that things have been massively rewired as such. And don't forget that our brains are being rewired all the time, right? Our brains are very plastic. Our synaptic connections are constantly being strengthened, weakened, ones we don't really use sort of fizzling out, ones that we do use, getting bigger, and, all the rest of it. So there's a lot of rewiring happening all the time, really. And so, to say that it's kind of fundamentally changing the rewiring, I mean, I don't know. My hunch is it probably isn't. Having said that, look, I mean, there's no question that as a sort of academic that teaches, you can't help but notice that students are, a far greater percentage of students don't take their final exams and have to resit them, a bit later, because of anxiety and stress and that sort of thing. And that's a very, very, very dramatic shift. But that, can you blame that on social media? I mean, I'm not sure you can, at least not yet. And the reasons will be very complex, right? I mean, it may be a greater recognition of mental health issues, which is good, but then people are like, well, then you can go to your doctor, you can get your sick note. I mean, probably in the olden days, lots of people were anxious and stressed, but didn't cross there was no option. It was like when you sit your exams or you fail. So then everyone going, so they sit their exams. And now there's the option not to. So kind of in a way, well, maybe why wouldn't you? So I think these things are really complex. I don't think they've been well investigated. And I hesitate to I've just done it. But anyway, I hesitate to speculate too much based on no data.
Yeah. No, it's a balanced answer. My bias would have been intuitively quite pessimistic on social media, just because I've seen that's the effect it's had on me, my friends, and the wider population within my sort of view. But it is my bias. I've looked into the data on depression and anxiety, and I found that it doesn't really go very exactly with how Jonathan Haidt has plotted it. If you go on Our World in Data, depression and anxiety has been incredibly constant for the last 3 decades, with only very small amount increases around COVID lockdown time, which I think we can generally agree of why that was. I mean, the world was basically on fire for like 3 years. But it's interesting. I was just curious on kind of what your intuition was with social media, the things that children are going to be missing out on, all the social comparison. I was just curious, is it something you're inherently more pessimistic or optimistic on? But I understand the data doesn't really exist yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think I could answer that question in 2 ways. Well, I could answer it as a developmental neuroscientist, and then I would be very kind of hesitant to say anything because I don't think we really know. As just a human being with teenage kids and all the rest of it, do I think social media is a great thing? Mostly not. I mean, having said that, there are good aspects of it, right? And I think it's easy when something new comes along that's a bit alien. It's easy to kind of say this is this terrible thing and it's destroying this kind of halcyon childhood that we all had. I'm not sure again, if you kind of take off the rose-tinted glasses, were our childhoods quite so halcyon? I'm not sure that's true. I know that certainly for my teenage boys, social media was a massive gift during the pandemic, where they were able to play games with their friends online, and they actually had social interactions that they wouldn't. That if that had not existed, they would not have had that at all. On the other hand, I can also see, the problems with attention span. No one reads a book anymore. No, there's they don't go out and meet their friends as much. But I think there is also a bit of a maybe the starting of a bit of a rebound against it, right? So I've certainly seen some of the teenagers and their friends kind of going, oh, we're having, an Instagram holiday. I'm going to taking it off my phone. I'm not going to do it for a year, and they won't do it. And then they'll slide back a bit. But I do that too. So I guess I'm a sort of naturally optimistic person, and so I do think that it's not all bad. I wish I do. I mean, I was quite strict about access to social media with my kids until the pandemic, when everything kind of went out the window. And maybe that was a good thing. I don't actually know. I mean, it was instinctive. Like you say, you kind of think, oh, it's probably not great.
Yeah.
But yeah, sort of scientifically, I don't think the data's there yet. So I'm going to hold my horses on that one.
Yeah, a very scientific answer. So let's move to something that you are an undisputed expert on, autism. Let's start on the very basic level. What is autism spectrum disorder?
Well, that's not a simple question, in fact. So I mean, there's a definition, right? So you can go to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the American kind of great tome that tells all psychiatrists the criteria for making a diagnosis. And if you look at that, it'll say that it's a disorder of developmental onset, and it's defined by behavioral changes. So it's defined by impairments in social interaction and social communication, with also repetitive or restrictive behaviors. Now, that's quite a kind of cold definition, and I think the reality is that it's not really a disorder. Right, it's a description of some symptoms that quite often go together, and the reality is that it's almost certainly a sort of massive catch-all of many, many, many different disorders that actually kind of segue into complete normality, actually. And that's, I think, why it's been so difficult to sort of study and unpick. So, and as people have done, there've now been a lot of genetic studies, right? So the last couple of decades has been incredibly rich in identifying the genetics of autism, which, by the way, is highly heritable. So it's has one of the strongest genetic components of any neuropsychiatric disorder, which comes as a surprise to some people. And but that means that everyone was like, well, we're gonna find something. I mean, I'm gonna find the gene or the genes, and of course they found hundreds of genes,
Yeah.
at least hundreds of genes. And that actually doesn't really surprise me, because you're really, it's not like you've got, I don't know, some skin cancer or something, right, where you can clearly see something and you can look at it under a microscope and it's got a histology and it shows a certain kind of pattern of behavior. This is really like just describing something and giving it a name, and it's very artificial. I always say, so when I was I used to be a medic, and when I was at medical school, I did some history of medicine research into a disorder called dropsy. And so back in the 18th century, dropsy was this disease where everything swells up, right? So your abdomen swells up, your ankles swell up, everything swells up. And so they gave it its name. They didn't really understand it, and they knew everything was swelling up. So they would sort of try and treat it by, taking fluids off you, sort of bleeding and, I don't know, leeches and stuff, right? And eventually everyone worked out that actually you can get swelling because you've got heart failure, or because you're not absorbing properly in your gut, or because your kidneys are failing. And so now there's no such thing as dropsy. There are all these other things that we actually do understand, and then you can kind of, go off down that route. And I slightly think that, autism spectrum disorder is almost a bit like that. It's just a description of something that we can see, but we don't really understand. And it's not a single disorder. It's probably not even a few disorders like dropsy. It's probably, many, many, many different ones that have been sort of thrown into a pot together. There are many people who would take issue with the idea that it's a disorder at all, and there's clearly one end of that spectrum who are completely fine, right? Maybe their social interaction skills are not as developed as in other people, but that at what point does that become not normal? And they certainly aren't interested in any kind of treatment. On the other hand, there are people with very severe neurodevelopmental disorders who have multiple issues, of which autism is one, and where they can't even tell you whether they would like a treatment because they don't speak, right? So there's this huge thing, and to try and think that they're the same thing, I think is almost unhelpful. So
Yeah.
I think probably in my hope is that in 20 years' time there won't be an autism spectrum disorder. It'll at least be broken up into something that's more kind of meaningful from a kind of etiological point of view.
Yeah. Yeah, no, makes complete sense. Is there any underlying neurological mechanism of autism, or any sort of neurological circuits that you can say, okay, we've seen it there, that covers the whole spectrum, or is that doesn't exist?
No, that doesn't exist. So there are some theories out there, and there are some sort of kind of general features that are seen fairly often. So, for example, I guess the classic one would be a very early study, actually, where they measured the head circumference of babies, and they found that that babies that then went on to be diagnosed with autism tended to have slightly bigger head circumferences. And actually so they kind of had this idea of this increased overgrowth, right? So this has led to this idea about deficient pruning, which, by the way, is just, that's just totally hand wavy. And which actually then, if anything, maybe declines a bit. So it kind of ends up normal, or on the kind of what you call the neurotypical trajectory kind of by adolescence. So that's fairly robust, and people have obviously done lots of MRI scans now and done more advanced imaging techniques, and sort of slightly enlarged brain, particularly cortex, is a common feature, particularly if you look at the severe syndromic end, but not by no means is it always seen, like not even close. And then if you think about circuitry, again, there are some hypotheses which again have been seen, I guess, more often than others. So there's an idea about connectivity. So there's one idea where you have this increased local hyperconnectivity and decreased long-range connectivity, and there's quite a lot of data that supports that in some cases. But like I say, the trouble is that it's not one thing. And so inevitably, I tell you, you could. I mean, I do this sometimes for lectures. I sort of find something and then I look to see if I can find the opposite, and you almost always can. There'll be some paper, saying this gets bigger, this gets smaller, this doesn't change. You find them all. So it's very inconsistent, and that's not surprising because this is not a homogeneous disorder at all. And then the more kind of, I guess, cell biological, neuro type idea is this concept of excitatory inhibitory balance. And so this is this idea that you've got excitatory synapses and cells in your brain, and you've got inhibitory ones that kind of dampen things down, and that these need to be kept in balance for kind of happy homeostasis of your brain function, and that in autism that these are somehow out of balance. Now, what's the evidence for that? Well, it's so I guess people have found there are lots and lots of studies where they found excitation might change, inhibition might change, they both might change. When this idea was formulated originally, it was very specific, and it was but actually it's clear that that's almost certainly that kind of very specific but quite simple concept isn't true for many cases. And so it's sort of been replaced by this idea of general balance, and any shift can alter it. I mean, the trouble with this is that you can imagine this is such a vague concept that it could apply to almost anything. I mean, most of what the brain does is excitation and inhibition. So to say that it's out of balance is, you might as well say there's something wrong with the brain, I think. But having said that, it has been a useful handle for people trying to think about, a more kind of neuroscientific framework. And with like all hypotheses, the idea is that you can, it's a starting point, and then you can build on that. And hopefully, one of the things we're interested in is trying to understand the heterogeneity and break it down a bit. So maybe there are groups where there are specific excitatory inhibitory imbalances in a certain way, and we want to kind of try and identify, are there relevant subgroups that are meaningful and that might then be useful in terms of thinking about, how best to manage different aspects of that.
Yeah. You mentioned that I think it was decreased local connectivity and increase, or it was the opposite way around. Was it increased?
Increased local and decreased long range. Yeah.
What would be the functional behavioral manifestation of that? What's the behavioral phenotype of that? We don't know.
We don't really know. I mean, so it's the other way around, right? So this is part of the problem, is that you can imagine, how are these studies done? So you're a psychiatrist, and you see your patients in your clinic, and people come to you, and then you recruit for some functional MRI study, and you put them in the scanner, and then you have some controls, and then you look to see what's different. So people have started to try and correlate MRI changes with, for example, these behavioral scoring systems for autistic phenotypic aspects. But it's difficult and iffy, and people get different things. And so, the sort of circular thing is to say, well, this particular change in connectivity is manifest by, social interaction deficits and communication deficits. I mean, I don't think we really understand enough to be able to even make that kind of quite sensible prediction. Like, if we could, and no one's really done this, but imagine that we could kind of deliberately create that in a kind of transitory way and then see what the impact was on behavior. What would be? I think we have no idea.
Can we say anything for sure about how the developing autism brain differs to the developing non-autism brain with the current category of autism that we currently have, which is a bit of a mess and very chaotic and very big?
I think the best we can say is that we know a bit about how brain development might be different in certain subsets, and particularly in certain model systems, right? And the trouble is, how do you translate that? So, for example, I don't know. So Fragile X, right? This is a syndrome. It's not actually someone that I work on, but it's a good example. It's because it's a chromosomal. It's a repeat disorder, and you get if you're affected, you often have intellectual disability as well as a bunch of other features, including a sort of fairly high incidence of autism. So it's often studied as a sort of example of autism. And then there are mice that have the kind of similar expansion of these repeats. And so and there are things we understand about those mice that are pretty robust, actually, across many, many, many different labs, different models generated by different people. How does that translate into people with that disorder is only just beginning to be understood, and that's for a single gene that we know, and that we can where these people are quite often. I mean, there's a spectrum of how severe it is, but nevertheless, at the severe end, these are people who would be very interested in a treatment of some kind, and so there's a lot of people involvement in working with scientists about this, because it's relatively common. There are enough people with it that you can actually build a cohort, and even then it's very difficult to kind of really pick. I mean, I think it's probably pretty clear, for example, in those that they have hyperactivity of in the cortex, and that you can do kind of EEG in people, and you can do recordings in mice, and they do seem to kind of match up a bit, but not totally. So it's and they had a big trial a few years back of a drug that seemed to be really, really promising in mice that then failed in people. So I think it's early days, and it's very challenging and again, more broadly in autism, like I said, I think perhaps it would be easier if we didn't think of it as autism spectrum disorder, because almost that makes it harder, right? That's like trying to come up with something that's generally true for this huge group of which there are almost certainly going to be people in it that have nothing from a pathophysiological level similar to other people. So it's a difficult one.
Yeah. How do we make research, or how do we make advancements in this field then? How do we start to tease apart what's probably a parent category of lots of different behavioral phenotypes? How do we start to tease them apart and, separating them out? What kind of research needs to be done to be able to do that?
So I mean, to be fair, I think, so it sounds like, we don't know anything, but that's not quite true. So, like I say, over the last couple of decades, there's been an incredible amount of work on the genetics. And I think that was a really good place to start, because it's something that we could get a handle on. And because we know from just looking at incidences for siblings and twin studies, that it's highly genetic. There's a strong genetic component. And that's really been very successful. So we now really know a lot about the genetics of autism. I mean, we haven't found all the genes. We found a lot. And the other thing that we know is that even though there are clearly at least hundreds of genes, they do tend to fall into certain categories. And the more studies that come out, so as we get access to new technologies. So, initially it was like really old-fashioned linkage studies, and then they started doing these copy number variant studies, and then they started doing exome sequencing, which is where you sequence just the bit of the genome that's actually turned into proteins. So it's basically much less and much cheaper. And then finally everything got much cheaper, and so now you can sequence the whole thing, right? Sequence the whole genome, but they're still pulling out the same categories of genes, which basically are genes that regulate other genes. So, do with that what you will. And then genes that are something to do with the synapse, basically. And so I think that gives you a big clue that, synapse development is going to be important. And it also gives you some high confidence genes that you can work with in terms of working in model systems to try and understand the pathophysiology. Because really, how you then go from a genetic change to any kind of behavioral change is not understood at all. So that, that's, to me, that's the big gulf that I think we should be trying to bridge. The other thing that I think we should be doing is working with clinicians who work with people, and making sure that we're targeting the aspects of the phenotype that people find most relevant to their lives, and B, that we try and, so like I said, the kind of things you can do in a model system is very different from what you can do in a person, right? You're obviously not going to stick electrodes into someone's head and start recording from them. Well, actually, occasionally they do that in epilepsy surgery, but mostly we don't do that. But the problem is that a lot of the kind of techniques that you use in people, like MRI scanning in EEG, are kind of, either they have very poor resolution or they're really proxy measures. And actually, what people are starting to do now is trying to bridge the gap and do either the same thing you do MRI in mice, say, people are doing that, but also trying to simultaneously do, say, MRI and, calcium imaging to actually understand how do they relate? How similar are they? Can we start to translate across these scales and species in a way that's meaningful? And I think that will make it easier to work together and to really start to understand the human condition from work in model systems. Because otherwise you could, it's all very well to, dissect out to the nth degree your one little circuit that you work on in your zebrafish or whatever. But, what does that really mean for a person is, it's possibly doubtful until you start to, fill in that gap. So probably those are the things that I would think are most important. Oh, and the final thing I think is that I think we should start thinking about circuits more than we think about than other bits, because I think that's kind of how the brain works, and that's something that we can sort of unpick to some extent in mice, say, and it's something that we can actually study a bit in people. So and that's probably, you can imagine that there are circuits for language, there are circuits for social interaction, there are circuits for sensory processing, right? So sensory processing is something that's often affected in people with autism, and sensory processing is something that's clearly conserved across many species, and can be something that people, would like, that they see as a priority to deal with. So, it's always good to go for those kind of things too. So I think, those kind of things are probably where I would put my money.
And have we been able to locate any functional circuit differences in any of the subsets of ASD currently? Like, is there a functional circuit that we can say is X different or Y perturbed in any dimension?
So in a way, so we've defined autism by a behavioral phenotype, right? So we're asking psychiatrists to assess, your social interaction, right, or your communication skills, and then they kind of, they have a little chart and they work out, and you then get handed your diagnosis. So there is no other test for autism, right? There's no blood test or brain scan or anything like that. But having said that, of course, those things that have been, kind of plucked out of the sky as the behavioral definition, because they're aspects of how our brain functions, there are circuits that underpin those. And actually we are starting to understand those. So for example, I don't know, social interaction is something where you can study that in people. You can put them in a fMRI scanner and you can, show them movies and pictures and, ask them questions, and you can compare people as well. And you can test that in model systems, and you can start to understand certainly at least at the level of the regions of the brain that are more active or less active, and that might be involved. So I think that kind of strategy is the way to go. So you say, okay, well, we have this, we now know that, prefrontal cortex is really important for social behavior in general in mammals. And, let's understand how the circuitry that connects prefrontal cortex to the other regions of the brain that are important for this is similar or different, how it's functioning. And then we can maybe drill down into the cell biology or, sort of downstream pathways in terms of cellular function that, that might be it might be affected as well. So, those, and then, I mean, there were other examples. I don't know, working memory might be something that, if it was, or flexibility, cognitive flexibility, that would be another interesting one where we do understand a bit about the circuitry. So yes, there are definitely circuits that are there, and people are totally investigating them. But I think, more could be done, and also in terms of understanding how, if you're missing a copy of a particular gene, how does that translate into that circuit being changed, but not this other one? Again, most people no idea.
Yeah.
So there's certainly a lot to do.
Do you think that progress into, again, breaking up the category into all of its subcategories, do you think that will happen on the level of increased behavioral phenotype specificity? Will it happen on the underlying level of, okay, we have identified circuits that are in, say, Asperger's syndrome and not in this other side? Like, what are the best diagnostic criterias, or will it always kind of be a mix of both? Like, where do you think that aha moment will sort of happen in the field?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and I wish I knew the answer. Especially, I've talked a lot to my clinical colleagues about this, because, I kind of can't help thinking that if only there was better behavioral phenotyping, surely we would at least be able to break it down a bit better. And they tell me that they can't, that they have tried this. Now, there was actually a real effort a few years back to change these behavioral descriptions into something that was maybe more sophisticated, had more granular detail, and maybe mapped onto what our understanding of neural circuits better. And somehow that sort of fizzled out. And I'm still actually trying to get to the bottom of why that was. I'm not I'm not a practicing clinician now. Possibly it wasn't that it was misconceived. It may have been just sort of logistics of getting, jobbing psychiatrists to actually use this in the clinic when, they have a limited amount of time and stuff like that. I don't know. I that's something I really want to try and find out. And I do think that there may be some mileage in that. Having said that, I do worry that, because of the way we've defined it, we're just always going to be slightly stuck, because we're looking at this sort of final common outcome, right? Like the dropsy, like the swelling. It's the thing you can see. It seems obvious, but actually the cause of it can be many, many different things. And if you understand how you get there, then you suddenly kind of sort of break it down and dissect out your groups. So I suspect that focusing on human behavior may not be the kind of may not result in the aha moment.
Yeah.
But I still think it's worth doing. Like I say, I think using genetics as a bit of a springboard, because you've got to hope that if you're looking at people with the same genetic cause, and that's true, and there are some where there are high penetrant mutations where you basically you have that mutation, you will get something. That's got to make the variability less, and I think there could be that could be a good place to start. But again, the trouble with that is because there are hundreds of genes, any cohort is going to be very small, and then human population is outbred. We're wonderfully varied, but that makes scientific studies quite challenging, because to really find the critical bits of gold in this sort of huge variable thing that's going on is actually very challenging. Yeah. But yeah, I think if we do apply these what we can at the moment, so MRI, EEG type studies, but try and relate it maybe to what we can learn from model systems in a more direct way, really work together, then maybe we can start to tease this apart.
Yeah no, makes sense. How do these behavioral phenotypes differ again between males and females? And would you almost have a completely different diagnostic behavioral criteria, or how in general does it divide up between boys and girls, males and females?
So yeah, that's a very good question. So the part of the issue is that, like I say, the diagnostic statistics manual doesn't have separate categories, right? So, like I say, social interaction, social communication, repetitive behaviors is the diagnosis. Having said that, it's clear that it manifests differently in males and females, and indeed, so there's roughly a sort of somewhere between 3 or 4 times higher incidence in males than in females for a diagnosis of autism. Now, why is that? There's a lot of people think that females will, because they just have their social brains are sort of slightly different. They're very good at masking, so they don't get diagnosed because they don't have as dramatic symptoms as the males. And then and quite often the kind of the effort of kind of constantly trying to kind of compensate and fit in eventually manifests in sort of anxiety, depression type problems, rather than the more obvious, social interaction, communication issues. So, and I think there probably almost certainly is an element where women are underdiagnosed, women and girls are underdiagnosed because they don't have such obvious symptoms, and the symptoms that they have kind of manifest in a slightly different way. There's also this idea that in some way there's this so-called female protective effect, so that women are somehow resistant to the kind of genetic changes that can trigger autism. And there's actually quite a lot of evidence that probably is true as well. So, for example, in some of these genetic studies, they found that the girls with diagnosed autism actually tended to have much bigger deletions than the males, and so suggesting that you didn't get your diagnosis unless you had a much bigger sort of genetic change, basically. So I think there's a number of different things, but yes, almost certainly women will manifest slightly differently and present, but that's a big generalization, and within that you can imagine there's every possible variation.
Could you go a little deeper on what you said related to deletions? Because I can basically piece together what that means because I studied neuroscience for 4 years, but I'm trying to figure out a way to communicate these ideas to a general population. So what does it mean that women are slightly more, say, neurodevelopmentally robust because they require larger amounts of deletions? Or explain that a little bit more and how those two things actually relate.
Well, so I mean, these are this hasn't been studied as much as it could be, but it's and often, I mean, the particular example I'm giving you was kind of almost mentioned in passing in one of these very big copy number variant studies. But what they did was, so copy number variants are where you basically have quite big either deletions or duplications of DNA. So like you've got your kind of your stretch of DNA, and there you'll have all your genes kind of on it and all the non-coding stuff. And we all basically lose great big chunks of our DNA, and sometimes they end up landing somewhere else, or we get duplications. So all of us are walking around with some deletions and duplications, and oblivious to them. If you happen to have a deletion that encompasses, or duplication that encompasses some very key gene, then that can increase your risk of getting certain disorders. And a lot of the kind of genetic studies into autism that were quite fruitful once they moved out the kind of linkage phase came from these copy number variant studies. And so in one of these very big studies, they actually kind of took some time out to look at male-female differences. And I thought what was really interesting was that the deletions, so you can imagine, so deletions they can have what sort of used to be called kind of micro deletions that only take out one gene, but many of these deletions take out multiple genes, so they're kind of huge. And when they looked at this was a couple of big data sets, but when they looked at males versus females, and so who have been diagnosed with autism, the females tended to have much bigger deletions, so they're going to be taking out multiple genes, and so you kind of, if you think about that for a minute, the frequency of these deletions in your average population is the same. So to get a diagnosis, you need a bigger hit, basically. So if you just had if you only had like, one gene affected or a little micro one, then, you don't get a diagnosis because you're basically doing okay. So that was the kind of idea behind that. And there were sort of some suggestions. I mean, there's some suggestion from, in the gene that I study, CHD8, which is again a very high confidence autism risk gene. There's evidence. I mean, there's got a high resistance in males and females and people, and in mice, there's data that suggests that most of the kind of cellular and circuit changes are stronger in males than in females. So again, they've both got the same hit. It's not a sex chromosome gene. It's not an autosome, but the females, they just seem to be sort of shifted so that it takes more to get them into the kind of phenotypic range.
Yes.
So again, sort of studies like that again suggest that there is some sort of female protective effect.
Interesting.
But this is a kind of a field that's really only recently getting ahead of steam as people now start to look at males and females more routinely. Because for a long time, as we've just discussed, they only looked at males.
And is it roughly true that the more deletions are correlated with behavioral abnormalities? So the more deletion count will be correlated with what we would say is a non-typical developmental route. Is there a direct correlation there or not exactly?
I don't think there's a direct correlation. I'm not a geneticist, so don't quote me on that. I mean, I think that if you have a really big deletion, especially that encompasses, more than one, important gene, then I think you're more likely to have problems. Yeah. But I couldn't tell you the data, so I don't want to. I hesitate to pronounce on that.
No, it's very interesting. But what you're basically saying that is if you somehow took all of the deletions that were in the female body and you somehow transplanted them into the male body, the male would have more outwardly displayable phenotypes is currently in ASD.
That would be the idea.
Yeah. Okay. Very interesting. So what can we do to improve how we integrate people that are on the lower end of performing and functionality into society better? How has your knowledge of studying this condition better improved how we should change how we govern our society to better integrate these people?
So I'd say that, I mean, my understanding of that derives more from my friends with autistic children than from my work, because I don't work with people. So this is not my area of expertise. So like I said, there's this huge spectrum. I think at what people used to call the high functioning end of autism spectrum. So as you say, you previously said Asperger's. So Asperger's technically doesn't exist anymore. It's been taken out of the diagnostic criteria, but it used to. It's basically a high functioning type of autism, and I think people who have who are high functioning, who don't have any other issues like intellectual stability or seizures or this kind of stuff, and have autism affecting only certain aspects, many of those would regard themselves as not having a disorder at all, which I think is perfectly reasonable. If you feel fine, then why on earth should you be told you have a disorder? And certainly wouldn't be interested in treatment. And I think, but I think would probably say that the world could make things easier for them, right? So just thinking about making accommodations in the way our classrooms work or in the workplace, and again, I think you just most importantly, you need to ask people what's going to help. I had one of my kids when he was little at primary school had a friend who was autistic and didn't like talking when playing online games, which is obviously what they were doing. And so my son taught himself to touch type at speed so that they could talk to each other on Discord, and his friend didn't have to speak. And then it was totally fine. And, my son, he was like 10 at the time, he didn't think there was any big deal in this. This was just like, well, his friend, he doesn't like talking because he's autistic. And so it was easier for him if we could type. So I taught myself to type, no big deal. Now we can play lots of fun games. So I think, thinking about just little things, but also bigger things, and making the environment easier, it could, I think, would be, really helpful. And actually, so, I'm recently disabled because I had a stroke about a year and a half ago.
Sorry
And
to hear that.
that's right. I'm very, very aware of how, when the environment is changed, I can basically live a completely normal life. But if I hit a flight of stairs with no railings, I'm stuck. So, and so it really brings home to me how small changes about the external world can make it possible for people to absolutely live the lives they want to lead, without, much lost from anyone else. So I think, thinking about that for that group is really important. You actually asked about the kind of severe end, and there, I think it's really difficult. I mean, some of these kids have, there are some with very severe seizures, with intellectual disability. There are kids that don't speak at all, which is incredibly frustrating. So then they get, very angry and become difficult to manage. And, so, and there, I think that just providing support to parents and to schools. I mean, there are quite a few charities who are trying to improve this. So obviously supporting someone in a normal school is great if that's going to work, but sometimes it might be better to be in somewhere dedicated that can really, really provide the kind of support that you need, that can cater to the sensory processing issues, that can, have just better, numbers of people around to make it a really, engaging and happy place where you can, flourish. And that just isn't going to happen in, your average school. So creating places like that, I think, can be really important. And then thinking about the long term, right? Because these are not just kids, they're going to grow up and they need to have lives. And so providing support, across the lifetime, if you're in that category. And then in the long term, I think most parents with kids like that would love for someone to come up with some treatments that will, help improve, but maybe particularly some aspects. I mean, I was very impressed. So I'm on the scientific advisory board of something called the Epilepsy Research Institute. So they focus on epilepsy research. But one of the things they did was they actually went out and commissioned a study into the top priorities of people with epilepsy, as to, if what's the thing that you would most like scientists to go away and research, if you get to decide. And that's really, really fascinating. And actually, I think really helpful for scientists, because then you can kind of go, okay, I know people think this is important, and this is what I'm going to go and do. And I think you could do the same for, if you did something like that for research, it'd be great. But you could also do it for, what would be the most useful things that we could, change in the environment, ideally that don't cost a fortune, because, money isn't going to come flying down, is it? And that, I think, would be really helpful as well. But I probably wouldn't presume to tell anyone, because, I don't work with people with autism, and so I don't have personal experience of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, what you say about the epilepsy patients make complete sense. It's somewhat kind of arrogant of us to assume that we know what problems they're dealing with without asking them. It seems like the first port of call should really be to talk to them. And I know in some cases that's not possible and much harder than other cases. But definitely having a more ongoing dialogue with them and the problems that they actually are suffering. Do you know of any early interventions that can be applied that does radically improve the functionality of different social modalities, or, abnormal sensory processing modalities? With an early diagnosis, are there interventions and treatments that can radically improve outcomes in those more severe cases?
So this isn't really my field. There are definitely sort of programs out there that people think will help. I couldn't tell you how good the data is, and I suspect it's quite individual, because often those kind of intensive personal type programs depend heavily on, parental involvement, ability to, attend sessions, sometimes finance, right, if it's not available, say, on the NHS. And then even, if you have some sort of specialist therapist, that person's, commitment and skill, etc., can be important. So, these are things that can be hard to measure.
Yeah.
And I certainly know people who found them beneficial, and I don't know much in detail about them, but I know that there are out there, particularly, for example, for sensory processing. So, and I think those things are great. I mean, there's and definitely, there are people who specialize in researching this and developing them, and that's a very important aspect, but not one that I work on. So
Yes.
I can't tell you in detail, but yes, there definitely are things out there.
No, that's completely fair enough. I just thought if there's anyone listening out there that maybe has someone in their life that they'd like a little bit more information on, I was just curious if you happen to have any knowledge on the intervention side.
I can find out. And it's not sort of thing I keep in my head, I guess.
Yes.
But I certainly can find out, if you want to, signpost. I can find out whether I've got some recommendations from people who I know have tried these things. Yeah. I do think that having an earlier diagnosis is a good thing because, like I say, acceptance and recognition and adapting around people, I think, can help a lot. And if you don't know, then you can't accommodate, right? So if your school doesn't know, then they're going to not even be able to. I'm going to start thinking about making accommodations and changing the environment so that it's suitable for all. So and maybe they should, but we live in the real world and people are very overworked, and sometimes you're just sort of getting through the day, so you're not going to think about that. But if once you're aware, then you start kind of going, oh right, well let's try and change this. So I do think that there, just from a very simple level, there is an advantage to knowing, and I think there's much less stigma than there maybe once was, certainly at least in the schools that I'm aware of. I don't think certainly the kids, they once they understand, they're like, oh now I understand, and then actually it just makes things much easier. Yeah. So just on that level, I think it's a good thing.
Absolutely. And that's why the more conversations like these, the better, right? It's just the more that they're out there, the less stigmatized they're going to be. I'd love to dive into your research. So what are the big questions that you're currently tackling and trying to decipher in autism? What are you working on in your lab currently?
So, well, you got a clue earlier on. So what I'm really interested in at the moment is understanding how genetic changes result in phenotype changes, so in behavior changes eventually. And in particular, I guess, I imagine that will be mediated via the cell, the circuit, the network. And so trying to explore that process, I think, will give us a much better understanding of what's happening, and potentially, targets for treatments for anyone who wants treatment, and also maybe be able to start identifying, points of convergence. So, breaking that down, that heterogeneity problem, because we've got at the moment hundreds and hundreds of genes. So you can imagine, if in the kind of there's one scenario which is definitely not true, which is that you have one thing called autism spectrum disorder, and one day we're going to find a treatment for autism spectrum is going to make everybody with autism spectrum disorder better in the way that they wish, right? This is not going to happen, right? Yeah. At the other end, you have thousands of different diagnoses, and if you have a particular really profound neurodevelopmental disorder with epileptic encephalopathy and etc., and you have this specific gene, and people will start thinking about gene therapy for that, right? But if you've got thousands of genes and it's complex and they interact, and you've got rare mutations, rare common variants, all these kind of stuff, well, rare variants that interact, it's going to get really complicated, and that's going to be, unless something changes significantly in technology, that's going to be very difficult to help anyone with that. So the idea is that, well, they do have this common phenotype at the end, and could it be possible that there's some fundamental aspect of, for example, how neurons are developing, or how a specific circuit, the synapses in that circuit, how they develop and interact, that may be common across a subgroup in a meaningful way? So I'm interested really in that. So I'm interested in synapse development and circuit development. And I'm actually interested in just understanding the basic rules that drive that. So we kind of have part of the lab that works on basic science questions as to just understanding development. But then we are also interested in synapse formation and circuit development in models of neurodevelopmental disorder. And having been a bit rude about excitatory inhibitory balance, of course, we do use that as the basis for what we're interested in, but from a kind of synaptic point of view. So we're interested, I think, all these genes that affect the synapse in one way or another, to me seems like a very big clue that, the synapse has got to be some sort of hub for where things are changing. And so really starting to getting into the weeds of how the development of synapses, particularly in those circuits that mediate those kind of behaviors that at the end, form part of the diagnosis, I think it's going to be interesting to look at, and hopefully understand some of both the genetic cascade and the cellular cascades that lead to that. So that's basically what we're working on at the moment.
Absolutely. It's very, very fascinating. I'm curious with these model organisms, what are the behavioral phenotypes that these model organisms display? Like, will these mice not play with other mice? Like, what do you actually see when you get these model organisms?
So, well, I guess it depends on the model system.
Sure.
So if we think about mice, so by the way, so mice behavior in the context of thinking about autism, it is quite challenging, right? And I think there has been a danger of kind of anthropomorphizing behavior. And having said that, to some extent, we are quite closely related to mice, believe it or not. And it may be that there's more, that the circuits are quite similar in some respects. And I think that once you start to understand that, it maybe gets more powerful. So, but it's true that when kind of research in this area started, people were pretty simplistic. So they were like, well, okay, at that point there was a triad. There was autistic diagnostic triad, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was social interactions, communication was separate then, and repetitive behaviors. And so literally people measured mice squeaks, which they regarded as communication, which I guess is kind of true-ish.
Yeah.
But they would like count squeaks. I mean, I'm not kidding. And then they looked at repetitive behaviors like mice will groom themselves, so they'll sort of clean their fur and stuff. And there are some mice out there that like massively overgroom to the point where they actually lose their fur. And so they were like, well, that looks like a repetitive behavior, And then there was a famous social interaction test, which is still used. And so it's called the 3-chamber test. And so you put your test mouse in one chamber in the middle, and then you have a chamber on either side. And in one, you have another mouse. And in the other, you have an inanimate object. And you basically measure whether the mouse prefers hanging out with the other mouse, or whether it prefers hanging out with the inanimate object. Now, you can imagine that there are lots and lots of potential issues with this. And actually, we had a scenario where there was a mouse with a genetic mutation that we were collaborating with another researcher who specializes in behavior at King's. And she had pointed out that when this had originally been done, it had been scored as they actually showed increased social interaction. So they actually spent more time with the other mouse than with the inanimate object, which seemed counterintuitive. And actually, it kind of got, as a result, that whole model kind of got ignored for a bit. Because it was like, oh, it's not, it doesn't really show autistic phenotypes. And then she actually looked at the videos more carefully and realized that, in fact, the mouse was trying to attack the other mouse. And it wasn't increased social interaction, it was increased aggression.
Wow.
So, you have to be quite careful when you do these behavioral studies. And you have to try and think of being a bit kind of ethologically relevant, because, mice, how do mice live? Like dark cycles are different. Do they live? They don't live in sort of big communities. They're not sort of hugely social animals. So, they're going to have quite different behaviors than people.
To say the least.
To say the least. Having said that, so I was very skeptical about the 3-chamber test for a long time, but actually there is now quite good evidence that the circuits that underpin that are actually quite similar to the circuits in the brain that underpin social interactions in people. And so I think when you start to get to that level, that gives you a much kind of stronger base to kind of then say, okay, now we're going to try and explore this. So so there are behaviors that you can study that that I think are pretty sensory processing is one that I don't personally work on, but I think is a very good one, because sensory processing is quite easy to study in mice, say, and it's also quite easy to study in people. Hasn't changed that much, I think. So that's I think communication gets very difficult, right? I mean, human communication is so unique that I think it's very difficult to try and extrapolate that onto something like a mouse, let alone a fish or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think so. Personally, I would say I would regard that as a bit too difficult. But other people work on this and get interesting stuff. But yeah, you just have to pick one that you think is going to be relevant, hopefully.
Yeah. Where do you see the next decade in autism research? Say you have a magic wand and we have lots of funding. Suddenly everyone really cares about this as a problem, which obviously they should. Where would you start developing technology that might help deciphering questions? So that's just purely technology that might help us look at things in more depth. And then as a second part of that, where would you actually start deploying the research funding? What things should we be looking at, but perhaps we're not?
Well, I guess so. I'm a bit biased. I really think that everyone should be looking at the kind of things that I'm looking at. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing it. So I think that there's this. So I think that, like I say, I'm basically going to repeat myself. So there are two things I think we should be doing. One is understanding more about how we go from I feel like we've done a lot of genetics. We know a lot about it. And we really don't have very much idea about how we go from genetics to behavior. And I think that understanding that, and not that many people are doing that, it is starting to happen, but nothing like with the same amount of money and numbers of people as for example, we're in, other aspects of the field. So I think that that's really important. And then the other thing I really think is really important is like I said, bridging the gap between mice and humans, I guess, if I'm going to be, simplistic. So model systems in general, but if you're going to do stuff in animal models, then and you're thinking about a disorder, you really need to know that it's at least likely to translate at some level. And so understanding more about because at the moment we're applying completely different technologies in these different systems. And so if I do some electrophysiology on some cells in mouse cells, and then I sort of claim that that's going to change the behavior in a person, well, that's quite a stretch. And maybe that's, so a lot of people would get cross with me if I say that that's the reason why these drug trials failed, because there were obviously lots and lots of very good reasons why they may have had problems. But I think it would definitely be helpful if there were objective readouts based, say, on EEG or MRI that you could use to know that your drug that you're trying has actually got to the brain, is actually having the same effect as you saw in your preclinical study, etc. Because a lot of these trials fail probably because the drug doesn't even get there, or you don't know if you got the right dose, and all sorts of problems. So some sort of biomarker I think would be really important. By the way, people are trying really hard to find biomarkers, but and with only very limited success. But I think model systems could help if we spoke the same language a bit more. And the problem is not just different technologies; it's different people, right? It tends to be clinicians doing the work with people, and it tends to be kind of basic scientists doing the work in the preclinical side. And I know because I run a PhD program where we bring these people together, and which is great, but they don't speak the same language. So you have to, you talk to someone who does MRI, they talk about connectivity. I mean, it took ages for the penny to drop that when they said connectivity, they did not mean what I meant by connectivity. Right? Yeah. I think of connectivity as like there's a synaptic connection that connects it together. Yeah. They mean correlated patterns of activity in time on, looking at blood flow in the brain. I mean, completely different. Yeah. So they might be underpinned by something similar, but not necessarily at all. So I think more crosstalk would be really important. And finally, I think if I had loads of money, I think diversity of funding. So Good ideas can come from lots of different areas. And if you put all your eggs in one basket, then you're probably going to miss something. So I think, lots of people working on it is a good idea, because then, more space for novel, creative ideas to come up.
Absolutely. Do you believe in any, and I apologize again if this might not be your exact domain of expertise. I feel like I keep asking you those questions, but I also feel like you're just humble about your domain of expertise. What about computational neuroscience? Do you think that there's a lot of promise in modeling these systems computationally, even using AI? And there's a DeepMind and companies like that are working on, biologically modeling cells. Do you think that there's some promise in that field over the next coming years? It could be really
so you have
exciting.
to be So you have to be careful about asking a neuroscience this question, because the EU spent 2 billion, or committed initially 2 billion euros to this project to kind of model the human brain. Which, it's not that it didn't do anything. It definitely produced some interesting stuff, and lots of computational neuroscientists, did interesting stuff. It certainly did not model the human brain.
Yeah.
And I would argue that we don't understand enough about even single neurons to really be able to do that.
Yeah.
Having said that, I do think that there's enormous potential in working together, again, to build models that, even if not perfect, can help make predictions that people can then go out and test, and vice versa. And again, there's an issue here, because we speak different languages. So again, I do really believe that greater collaboration and trying to learn each other's languages and trying to work together to do innovative things would be great. And yes, I do think there's a huge potential role for computational neuroscience to play in understanding these disorders. I mean, there's by the way, computational psychiatry is a very big and trendy field at the moment. So it's not like, people haven't had that idea. And certainly when it comes to a lot of the big data sets that are coming out now, so whether that's imaging or, omics type thing, there's clearly a lot of complex computational stuff going into, stuff being a very technical word, but anyway, going into sort of interpreting those data sets and really sort of drawing out meaning from them. So, in that sense, definitely important. Actually, and I'm allowed to say this, I'm like, no, okay. I have had interactions with some DeepMind folks. Which I do think that there are interesting things that interesting kind of mutual ways in which artificial intelligence could help us understand things, and vice versa. Again, it's a bit tricky logistically, I think, to make that happen. But that would, again, if I was, waving my magic money wand and creating an institute, I would definitely be embedding everyone together, so that they would, in the hope that they would interact and come up with some cool stuff.
Yeah. You've piqued my interest with that DeepMind thing. I'll have to email you after the podcast and find out what the secret details are there. This has been so much fun. So final question. This can be, you can relate this to autism or not, but it's an open end. I like to ask this question at the end of the podcast. So the next decade in neuroscience in general, I want to know, what are you most excited about? And then the inverse of that question is, what are you most scared of? The next 10 years in anything related to neuroscience. So this could be neurotech, could be gene therapies, anything even tangentially related to the brain and the development of these fields. What are you excited for? What are you scared for?
So I guess I think the thing that I have found most exciting in terms of breakthroughs is brain-machine interfaces. So there was a recent paper, there's some recent studies where they've really, in an astonishing way, kind of broken the barrier in terms of getting something meaningful going on, and now I think. And at least I hope that that's going to really kind of accelerate, because it's been so difficult for so long. So, and that obviously has a huge potential to kind of change lives as well. So I think that, and by the way, it's not easy. So I don't think it's not going to be like, it's all going to just happen now in the next 10 years. So that's why, but I do think that there's been such a breakthrough, and 10 years is what it will take to get it kind of, more reliable, more effective and sort of and going into the clinic, as it were. So I
Do
think
you have a
that's probably.
specific application that you're most interested, like a very specific application of those brain machine interfaces that you're most excited for?
So I guess basically people with neurological injury, so stroke or other injury where you can't communicate, or I suspect once they've got them going, you could potentially change the outcome in many different ways, actually. So it depends. It's not. I don't work in this field, so I don't know what all the caveats are. You only see the amazing movies and the great
Yes.
talks, right?
Yeah.
So I suspect it's probably not as simple as all that. But the first thing is kind of locked-in syndrome or something like that. But if it really works, then there are any neurological injury of which there's just so many people with that could be helped with that. So I think it's just got immense potential, and it's kind of fascinating as well. So I think that's probably the big one. Kind of down from that a bit is something that I'm working on. So I guess sort of a bit more closer to home would be gene therapy. I think that that's something that well, again, that's had a big breakthrough, but by the way, it's totally non-trivial, especially when it comes to more complex disorders. And so I do think that in 10 years' time, there are going to be big advances there that will be really exciting. I'm working with people at King's to try and develop new ways to do that. So I think that's also quite cool and quite exciting, and definitely in my field, that's, I think, one of the things that could happen in that sort of timescale. What I'm most afraid of, well, that's easy. I'm most afraid of AI, and I think it's if I could wave I've had a lot of magic wand waving in this interview, and if I could wave a magic wand and make it go back, I would.
Really?
I don't think. I mean, so I thought that for a long time, and I just all my worst fears are only being confirmed by the day. By the way, I think that's remotely possible. Genie's out the bottle. We're where we are. I'm encouraging my kids to go, program and learn about AI, and because I think that is where everything, a lot of exciting things are going to happen. There's going to be lots of good stuff. I think it will be net negative. It's my personal guess, but we as a society are just going to have to adapt to that and hopefully make it through. But I do think it's terrifying. I mean, there are so many ways in which it is terrifying.
Which one is most specific to you? Because I've been curious about when I ask this question to people. AI has been the answer a few times, but almost every time the actual specific AI use case has been completely different. I had one professor say AI-assisted drones that can kill people, and they didn't need much more explanation there. I accepted that answer.
That's high on the list.
yeah. That was like, okay, you've thought that one through. You just instantly said it as well. Another person said, a loss in human meaning from AI taking over things. What would be your specific fear that you're scared of that AI will change in society?
So actually, there are a lot. But by the way, AI assisted drones that can kill people, they are already here, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is not like the terrifying future. This is now.
Yeah.
So, and I do find that terrifying. I think that in the shorter term, if it fulfills, I mean, I don't think it's there yet, by the way. I think, it's been quite hyped, and it's not quite as good as it superficially appears. So I don't think, it's not happening right now, but I do worry about employment. I think we need, we may moan about jobs, but we do need work, at least in society as it stands, to give meaning and purpose to our life. And if you don't work, I think it's very difficult actually to kind of keep that up. I mean, people can do it, but usually, quite special people. So I do worry that, imagine that they finally get their act together on self-driving cars, and all driving jobs disappear.
Yeah.
Right. That's, I think someone's quoted a statistic of like a third of all jobs in the US. Anyway, it's a lot, whatever it is. Suddenly you've got a huge section of the population that are just unemployed. Now, that people can say, well, we've had big, tech advances and people have adapted, but that's a big shift. And if AI is as good as they want it to be, then everyone's out of a job, right? So apart from physiotherapists, and I mean, maybe even them. I don't know. I mean, so I think that's a kind of more short-term thing. And, I guess am I worried about being taken over by robots? Not as much, but I wouldn't rule it out. I mean, there's a sort of whole list. There's a whole list, and I think we've been in this sort of very, very privileged position because of our intelligence as a species, and maybe we've abused that, right? I mean, no question we have, but nevertheless, it's been good for us mostly. I mean, again, there are swings and roundabouts, but mostly, compared to other species, we've done pretty well. So, why would we want to create something that's more intelligent and more powerful than us? I mean, I don't know. That could go wrong. There could be huge benefits to society. It could be well done and well structured and planned so that, nothing goes wrong. But then, we don't have a great track record on that front. So
No, we don't.
It does worry me. I worry for the future. But on the other hand, I don't worry too much, because what can you do? So
you said you were generally optimistic at the start of the podcast. You're more pessimistic now.
Well, you did ask what the thing I'm most
Yes, that's on me. Yeah. That's on me. This has been incredible, Dr. Laura Andreae. Thank you so much for your time. I've really, really appreciated it. I've learned so much. I hope the listeners have as well. It's been great.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.